Cool, man. So, Robert, it's awesome to have you here, man. Why don't you get into a little bit about yourself? I'm curious about you. If somebody were to ask who you are, what would you tell them?
I think that answer has a lot of parts, both
Yeah.
both the roles I play. So I think I'm an entrepreneur, I'm a father, I'm a husband. These days, I'm a little bit of an author and a speaker. So play a few different roles.
Right on. Okay, so you kind of answered the second question, which is what do you do for a living there? So let's get into that a little bit more because it's interesting. What give me the full-fledged answer if somebody were to ask what you do. Kind of walk me through that, and then we'll walk through kind of the how you do it.
Yeah, so I'm gonna align a little bit to Derek Sivers, who I interviewed my podcast on here. Like I've started a few companies and I've been an entrepreneur, right? But I think there are different phases and different seasons, and creating companies is not what I'm doing right now. I think a lot of people define them on that. I built and grew a company called Acceleration Partners that I've stepped out of day-to-day operating role. I'm more of a board member now. I built a couple other companies which have been sold or failed or otherwise. And along the way, I started writing and sharing ideas and building a little bit of a platform doing that, and became passionate both about partner and affiliate marketing, leadership, culture, and started sharing those ideas. And that's kind of led to six books. So my time these days is split between being the chair of Acceleration Partners, continuing to grow that platform, but more of a board member and coach to the team role, working with other companies as an advisor or member, and then my speaking and writing. I'm working on a couple new books right now, and yeah, so it's a few different parts, and I'm enjoying the diversity, particularly after kind of spending 10 years doing one thing, 100 miles an hour.
Right. Oh, right on, dude. Yeah, I get that. What about the books that you're writing right now? Tell me about them.
I've got three sort of in the works
Huh.
that are different phases. Two are actually written and one's a concept. So I wrote a book 5 years ago about eliminating 2 weeks notice. And it was the subject of my TED Talk, which actually just crossed 100,000 views. And just when I was about to come out with that book, it was COVID, then it was the Great Resignation. It just was never time. And I was like, look, the same problem still persists. The way that people leave companies doesn't make a lot of sense for the workforce today. So I've dusted that off, rewritten it, cut it down, and probably will release that even for free this summer on Substack. I just want to kind of get it out into the world. I've written a parable, which was on core values, which is something I talk a lot about in my work and leadership, and it double clicked into that whole topic.
Hmm.
And then the development one that I'm working on is a book kind of connecting leadership and parenting in a new way.
Interesting. Okay, so let's get into the tie between leadership and being able to have this viewpoint in terms of the 2 week rule, which is interesting. But I want to see where your mind goes when I ask you if you were to help me with leadership, for example. Where do you typically start with folks, and then we can kind of walk through your process.
Yeah. So having run and been part of professional service firms for 20 years that are all
Yeah.
about people, I have found that a lot of leadership is just understanding who you are at your core, understanding those core values, understanding the people on your team, who they are, what makes them tick. We're all fundamentally different. So I kind of spend a lot of time with the why process. I spend a lot of time around core values and using that to help people understand what they're good at, who they are. They're going to lead authentically from their values, and then understanding that people on their team are different and have different
Yeah.
experiences and have different leaders. And that is at the root of a lot of opportunity and a lot of problems. I think, there are a lot of these personality tests out there. I don't think those are necessarily descriptive of people's personalities, but they tell you how they tend to behave and things that they do well and things that they do better, and they inform their communication styles. And when I've seen people really kind of getting into trouble or butting heads, they are avoiding something about themselves or how they intuitively are, and they tend to be kind of repeating that mistake. So,
Hmm.
um, whenever I work with our own leaders, it's about understanding their why, understanding their core values, looking around at a lot of these strengths and weaknesses, and suddenly all the 360 feedback, all the things that they do well, all the things they struggle with, the people they connect with, the people they don't connect with, start to make sense under that lens. And if you have some self-awareness, you can kind of redesign and elevate your leadership with that foundation.
So where do you start with that? I love the why because you start with the why, then you move into the how. That's the way I look at it. So let's just say somebody doesn't have a why, they don't have that ferocious mission that they get up every morning excited.
Yeah.
They got that why that's
I
intrinsic.
yeah,
So how do we start with that?
there's a Simon Sinek got people started on this, but then
Yeah.
kind of left them hanging. A gentleman named Gary Sanchez, who I was actually on the phone with this morning, do a lot of work with, has actually developed archetypes around whys, and I found them to be, and he
Interesting.
has an assessment. I found them to be incredibly accurate
Mm,
and predictive of people's behavior holistically across work or otherwise. Again, my why is to find a better way and share it. Like that's why I'm on this podcast. That's why I write these books. That's why I
interesting.
write the newsletters. Like if I figure out something that I think can make something better, I inherently want to kind of crowdsource it. So he has 9 archetypes. And then he and I have done some work together because I also have a core value kind of assessment and program where people can figure out their personal core values. And I think the combination of those, usually the why is often the dominant core value, but I think the core values give people a little bit more description about the types of environments and situations that they'll do better in.
Hmm. So what about the archetypes, man? Because that's super fascinating to me. Are you familiar with Carl Jung's archetypes at all?
No, I mean, I've probably heard them. I think a lot of these things
Course you've heard them. Yeah, that's where
oh
it stems
yeah,
from though. It's the
overlap.
complexes
Yeah.
reside in an archetype, and then people tend to live within one primary archetype usually, and then they
Yeah,
shift
and if you've
around.
ever been in one of these exercises where you have a facilitator, I just remember
Yeah,
doing one for DISC a few years ago. And they would ask, the room was divided into their quadrants, and they would ask questions
interesting.
like, how many of you would do this? And one quadrant would not raise their hands at all, and the other quadrant would all raise their hands. And so you just start to see how this stuff impacts behavior. I
Hmm.
think they're 9. I won't get them all, but one of the more common ones are to find a better way to make sense of things, people who are driven by the right way or the right solution, people who are driven by simplicity or contribution or otherwise. And I've really worked through people again in the context of leadership where one of these things was really driving a lot of the struggles or not or lack of awareness around one of those things. So
Mhm.
what Gary and relationships based on trust is one of them. So Gary and I were talking about this morning. I've seen real challenges. People who have relationships based on trust as a core value or a why typically stems from some violation of trust in their life or otherwise where that became important. But they tend to kind of
Hmm.
keep small circles and they need to know they're trusted. And for people on their team, they're either trusted or they're not. And you can lose trust very quickly and you can be in jail without the key and not know it. And if they don't realize that they're managing that way, it can cause a whole bunch of problems versus for someone to say, look, Kyle, like I'm your new manager. I'm someone who's very driven by trust, like showing up for late for meetings, missing deadlines when I can't find you, in the afternoon. These are all things that damage trust. And it's really hard to repair trust with me once it's broken. Now you're kind of like giving people the keys to the car, on the team and telling
Yeah,
them kind
yeah.
of what's important. Like for me, you come late to a meeting, but you come with like the right answer. Like I don't give a crap that you're late to the meeting. Like I'm not, it doesn't trigger overuse words, but it doesn't trigger or set off the same things in me. If you come to a meeting and say there's absolutely nothing we can do to do this better, or we should just keep doing it how we've done it, then those are fighting words for me.
Because you've identified that archetype, the values that you bring to the table, and that just violates those values to the point where it's like, okay, it's
Yeah.
fighting words, as you said. It's on like Donkey Kong, baby. But
Look, and there's situations where my strengths are helpful in roles, and there's
yeah.
situations where I will be terrible and not very good because it's fundamentally just not sitting with me as a person.
So let's go through some of the values and the archetypes. First of all, don't place me in the bucket of the distrust. You could have used the example of, oh, yeah, I trust him because X, Y, and Z. Let's put me in that basket. So let's go through some of the archetypes. How do you discover, or really the values that really permeate the archetypes that you generally stay in? How do you typically identify your values so that way you can be have that self-awareness and be able to take advantage of them?
Yeah. So
whole
the
self.
thing on look, the why stuff, Gary's developed an assessment and all that stuff, and he's done a great job on that. And he didn't have that assessment. The core values are a little different because they're a little unique for each person. If I gathered 10,000 of them, I could probably find some patterns.
Yeah, yeah.
But they're a little unique. And so I figured out a process and a bunch of questions that sort of elicit those. Most of us, I think, inherently know some of our values. We just can't articulate them. So the analogy I use is if you're driving a sports car through a tunnel and you turn off the lights, it's going to like, go past the lane that you can't see. It's going to hit the wall. It's going to make a terrible grinding sound. You're going to be like, oh, the wall. And then you're going to pull it back to the middle and then you're going to do the thing on the other side. And you're probably going to get out of the tunnel because there's nothing in front of you, but your car is going to be all dinged up and smashed up, right? Like, I think that's how a lot of us kind of go through life. We're like, oh, I'm values driven. Like, really, what are your values? I asked 100 out of 98 people, and at a party, and like only two can ever like say what they are. The rest sort of know, and when they're violated. To me, like when you can put a word or a name to them, it's like turning on the lights in that tunnel and seeing the yellow line and staying away from it and being like, look, this is where I should go, and this is where I shouldn't go. So there aren't any specific archetypes. What I kind of have is a process for people to help figure that out so that they can look at their they can kind of figure out their own core values and put it on their desk and say, look, this is my decision making rubric. I should do more things that are aligned to these, and I should try to avoid things, because when a value is crossed, it feels horrible, right? And one of the tests of if something is a core value, if I got a sense like, Kyle, again, I'm just using the trust, but that, some trust vibes with you. I'd say, well, when someone violates your trust, like, how is it? Is it, matter what they say? Are they dead to you? Like, they're dead to me, right? Or if you're at a party and someone's telling stuff that seems not to be true, you're like, I'm done with this person, right? So the contra, when you give someone an archetype of sort of an anti-value, that's a good test for a value, because it's like kryptonite. You should not be able to be around something that is the opposite of your value. It should make you feel like bad and uncomfortable.
So that's how you know when you're violating a value. But how do you turn the lights on, man? If you're in the tunnel and the car's lights are off, you're smashing from wall to wall, and it's
Well,
uncomfortable.
you
Notice
get
that. How do you
look,
just
people had
switch that
asked me for
switch?
years, and it just wasn't an easy thing to do. So I took the process I did with a lot of my management team, and I turned it into, it's an hour course, and there's 6 questions, and it walks you through the questions and how to take the answers and look for the themes and figure out what the values are, and then what's a good filter test on that. So it's at corevaluescourse.com if anyone's interested.
Okay, what's the first question?
I think the first question is when in a team, like when in a explain some experiences in a professional environment, well, where you feel like really successful and you were doing your best work, right? And what were the circumstances around those?
Mm. And then so you go for the positive side of things there, and then the negative side of things to kind of get both, so
Which are two sides of the same coin.
yeah,
So
of
you
course. So
then
you see,
take
and then you
you
find the
tend
middle of the two.
you take the
Exactly.
negative things and you flip them, and then you see that it starts
Yeah.
to align to a bunch of the positive things. Yeah.
Where do you see the philosophy of that? Are you in tune with the yin and yang, the whole philosophical angle of the two being one? Where do you go with that in terms of discovering your values and really living to your true self and potential?
Yeah, I'm not. I mean, I obviously know about yin and yang. This was a very personal thing for me that made a huge difference in my life, and that I had seen that a lot of people who were really high performing and aligned and connected had sort of figured this out. And when I figured out this rubric of capacity building and this notion of spiritual capacity, which is like, who are you and what do you want? For
Mm,
most people, that was core values. That was like, if you're not building your work life or personal life, professional life around what you intuitively value the most, you're going to really struggle. Or for a lot of people, you're going to climb the wrong mountain.
interesting. And it depends, dude. It depends on the personality type. For example, an entrepreneur, well, their values might be when they try to explain them, what they don't want instead of what they do want, as opposed to, let's say, an
Right.
artist who paints on canvases, might say what they do want in terms of the values. And like you said, the same thing, but
Yeah,
different ways of
people say a
discovering.
lot, I'm very values driven. But again, if you said to them, could they say my core values are health and vitality, find a better way of sharing it, self-reliance, respectful authenticity, and long-term orientation. Like that's a different level of clarity. And therefore, when I have a people decision or a business decision or a financial decision, and I sort of line it up to those, it's a pretty good rubric of like, do this, don't do this.
Right. And so, yeah, I've done the values work myself, dude. And it's fascinating because then once you have the values laid out, I came up with 7 words, one single word, which was important to me. And then under the
One of
each of
my
the
one of my rules is no one words, but that's a different discussion that we can
Okay,
have.
we could talk about that, which is interesting because
Yeah.
one of my rules was one word for ultimate simplicity, and then I could break them down into bullets beneath the words to make sure that I've got the full crystallization, the full clarity on each.
That
Why
I
not
believe
one
in, and a
word?
lot of companies have a thing. And then I just think a word. I see a lot of integrity and honesty, and there's like a 3 point test that I sort of have around. Can you make a decision on it? Can you sort of rate yourself on it,
Yes.
and a bunch of things. It's really hard with one word. Like was I, to me, like was long-term orientation like pretty easy to be like, all right, here's I did this well, or look, I've struggled in the last couple years trying to manage businesses because I'm usually focused on the long term, and it's been all about crisis management and the short term. So
Yeah.
I think when you have one word, it's really hard to like know what you're talking about or make an assessment on that. I think it's important to have a little differentiation in it. Again, I've broken down a lot of people who said my core value is integrity, and I've come up with 7 different definitions of integrity.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Right. So that's the way I think about it. The way I pictured it for some reason, and this is weird, but it's the way it's the image that came to mind was, let's say 7 blueberries or 7 grapes. So the word was the grape itself, and then I wanted to flesh it out to see what color the inside was, what the flavor was, really start well, first of all, access the different modalities with the inside, but flesh it out, try to bring the whole thing, the size of it in comparison with the other grapes or the blueberries. It's a weird example, but because I think about it holding juice, holding value, there's some
Yeah.
there's nutrients
And,
inside of it.
and look, doing some of these things is better than none. Again, I have just found that the phrase, matters a lot and what makes it
Yeah.
actionable, right? So, it might some one words are better than the other. Other one word, if you're trying to know whether you're meeting the standard of something, a one word definition is very hard.
Right, because everybody's got a different definition of it. That's why you got to go into
Like
the flesh of
integrity
the grape.
again, is
Yeah,
integrity
well,
telling the
yeah.
truth? Is it, I've heard people saying it's being intentional. I've heard others saying it's doing what you say and say what you do. Like those are all different definitions. So if I'm using it as a decision making guide, if I'm using it as an assessment tool, like I feel like it needs a little bit of differentiation. Like back to my core value of long-term orientation, like very clear what that means around choices, investment choices, relationship choices, business choices. Like that's how I'm thinking about the situation.
Explain what you mean by that, the thought process that goes behind that, really the way that you think about that. I mean, how do you know that that's your value? And then how does that actually affect your decision-making process when it comes to a tactical decision you got to make A or B? How does that, what's the actual thought process that goes into it? Is it
Yeah,
a
look,
feeling? Is it a very
we would
cognitive thing?
spend a whole hour. And again, why everyone's like, can you help me with this stuff? I'm like, it's complicated, which is why
Yeah.
it's like an hour course. And it's not an hour of work, but it's an hour to go through that whole process. So getting in the weeds of that will be too much for this. But the output of that, I think, are core values that again, I can look at decisions. I can look at things that I need to do. I can look back and say I did this or I did this well, and it sort of meets those thresholds. And to me, it's an ultimate decision-making rubric. So I talk about the big three
Mm.
of decisions in your life. So your vocation or the place that you choose to work, your partner, and the community that you choose to live in. I think if those are not core value aligned, they have a very low chance of success. So wouldn't it be helpful to have a really clear litmus test again on your desk of like what's important to me, rather than me kind of knowing it and knowing when there's a problem and the alarm going off, but to say I should walk away from door number one and I should walk into door number two. I've never seen a personal or professional or community context where someone is really not aligned, where they are feeling good about that situation.
Right. So it's a because you mentioned an alarm bell. So is that a feeling? I mean, do you cognitively go through and maybe list out the, I mean, like how what's the thought process behind it? For me, it's a switch in my chest. If I have a because I let a
When,
dim
I, when
focus
I'm
take care of
testing
it.
it, so if you're going through the process and it seems like you have a value of generosity, right?
Yeah.
And I'll say to you, let me ask you, Kyle, you're standing at a party and you're talking to this girl, and she is just talking about like, her trust fund and all this stuff and playing a victim. Like, usually I'll say, how does that make you feel? And half the time, if it's
Hmm.
kind of a hit, you don't have to, they don't have to answer. The look on their face is like revulsion, right? I mean, it's a very visceral experience to someone or an action or something that just violates your values.
And then asking, how does that make you feel? It's like the classic therapist question, but there's
No,
value
it's the
in
avatar. How does the avatar of the inverse make you feel? Right? Because it sort of puts them in that, again, picture you're at the party.
yeah.
Again, so for me, self-reliance. And there's some opposites of self-reliance that are good objectively, and then there's some other ones that I would argue are more problematic. But again, if they're there talking about, their trust fund in a different way, their trust fund and their allowance and needing everyone's help to make a decision. And I'm just like, ugh, like get me away, like get me away.
Right. Well, you said the avatar of the universe, is that right?
The avatar of the inverse.
Of the inverse. What do you mean by that?
So the surest test of a value in that case is again, you're inventing the avatar of the inverse of that
Which is
value.
the trust
So
fund,
so if you're a
victim.
generosity person, I'd make up someone who looks really
I got
ungenerous,
you. I
right?
see. Okay, okay.
And sort of be like, what, tell me what it's like, what is it like? And they're like, no big deal. Or like, oh, like can't, right?
So when you're making a decision, something important, and you perceive the results as grave to the future of how it plays out. It's funny because a lot of the time it's not, but we make these stories in our heads where it's like this is so important, this has to work out this way, and then a lot of the time it goes the opposite way because you tried to force it there. What does that decision making process actually look like for you? Like in the real moment, if you had to make a decision, let's say you're in a helicopter and you have to make a decision whether to evacuate or to try to fix the helicopter that's going down. How do you know which is the right move to make in that moment? Hey, I hope you're enjoying the podcast, and I want to let you know that I've got a free book that you can get if you want to tap into more of these resources. And you can get that for free at kylesbook.com. Back to the podcast.
Well, I mean, I'll give you a recent example of this in my own sort of, again, I think everyone's different. So I don't know if you've seen this video from it's like an Eastern European ski resort where the lift goes absolutely crazy and it goes like 100 miles an hour and it goes in them and it's throwing people, off like
Huh.
around the corner, right? Have you seen this at all?
I have not. No, but I was skiing the other day, man. God damn it.
So it's sort of terrifying. And
Yeah.
like the first couple of people don't realize what's going on. But now you can see you're coming in and you can see that these people are flipping and ejecting. And like in my case, I am going to jump. And maybe I haven't internalized it, but I am going to self-reliance, take control of that situation
Hmm.
and take what I looks like the least bad. And I'm not going to like let this go up into the whim. Again, someone else may have a different value that made them make a different decision, but I can tell you in that case, like I actually just interviewed the CEO of Delta Airlines on my podcast. And one of the things we were talking about was, anytime there's a delay or a problem with my flight or otherwise, there's people who like stay and wait for the next day. And I like get on a flight and go to where I'm going. Like I go towards where I'm going, right? Like it might be the wrong choice, but there's definitely something intuitive to me around feeling like I'm in control, I'm in movement or otherwise,
Hmm.
whereas the other people might not want to force something. So there, again, we just have different DNA in the way that we handle things.
It's interesting. The whole forcing versus going with the flow. I try to go with the flow because it's difficult to, it just brings on, especially if I have no control over the situation. You got for me, I got anxiety that builds up. It feels like there's a line in the corner. I have to make some sort of a decision and I'm learning. I'm not perfect at it, but I'm learning to kind of just take a step back and observe. If I can't do anything about it, then let's just sit with the
So would
uncomfortable.
you jump or not jump off the ski lift?
That's a different situation because you have to take control. There is something that you can do to
But
change the situation.
you might not jump just because you might be a slow processor and take in the two situations. And again, you might turn out okay. Like maybe I jumped off and it
But
was
see, this
worse.
is the
But yeah,
difference of what we're talking about is you have control over jumping or not jumping. There's a two options there. I'm
yeah,
talking about sitting back when there are no options. I've done everything that I could possibly do,
yeah.
and it's not up to me anymore. That's what I'm talking about. Okay, so if there's nothing I can do to control the situation now, if you're in an airport and you get the delayed flight, I mean, it's difficult because how do you know that you're going to get there faster if you do take a flight on the same direction, but maybe not to the
You
same
don't.
city? And so
But
the adventure is the
one
way to look at
course
it.
is likely to just sit better with you and feel better, right? So someone with a value of let it happen, right, is probably gonna just orient to things differently than someone with a value of self-reliance. Like it just that's just the reality.
Is there a
Might the
dichotomy
decisions,
there? A dichotomy between being able to, because the way I'm seeing it is the person who sits there, it depends on the situation, but let's use the flight delay example.
yeah,
There is a real self-reliance there by being able to sit in that moment and not be able to not have to react to external stimuli. That's the ultimate self-reliance to me because it's you're not letting
yeah, it depends.
your
Look, this and then
complex
again, this
emotions
depends
take
on your
over you.
definition of it, as you said. Yeah, this gets into a lot of nuance, but assuming that again, there's not one per person, like there's multiple, right? So again, one of my other values is find a better way. So I am just more more likely to try to figure out a hack, right? Or figure out a different city or get motivated by trying to figure out the path home that no one else figured out.
It's an interesting line that we've got to draw between when to control and when to let go. And yeah, I feel like a lot of unhappiness comes from trying to control something you can't control. But if you can control it, like on the ski lift or on the delayed plane, I get the sense of empowerment that you get by making that decision to take things into your own hands. I take a different road with it. I oftentimes, if I've got a decision that I can't figure out which one is the one that I want to choose, I'll just flip a coin and I'll just let the flow go with it, you know? That's one of my values is being able to accept what is and not try to force something that wasn't meant to be. What do you think about the coin flip decision making process? Is it batshit crazy to you?
What do you mean? Like, oh, if you don't know, just flipping a coin?
Yeah, if both have their values and both have their pros and cons, and you can't make a decision in terms of which one's which one you flip a coin. What do you think about that?
Again, it's probably like I'm not likely to flip a coin because
Because it
I'm
goes against your
probably
values of control.
yeah, and also just like whether I'm not saying it's the right answer. I think the people who want to flip a coin sometimes are very they again there's a why of like the right way. Like and people the right way can be very indecisive if they're not clear what the right path is. So in
Mhm.
those cases, they want to relieve themselves of having to figure out what the right thing is. So again, it serves different purposes for different people and in different situations. I can't remember a time when I flipped a coin. Like again, I probably want to believe that something in my head can tip the odds or better choice. I'm not saying the outcomes are any better or different, but I don't like gambling. I hate slot machines. Like
Right, me too.
none of
Yeah,
those
well,
things.
yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, it's a different thing though. It kind of is similar, but I mean, I don't gamble myself. I think it's silly going to the
Right.
casino. The odds are stacked against you. Why play a game when the odds are against you? When you can formulate a game as a business and stack the odds however you want to structure them. I think that's what you're talking about. So there's an interesting little balance between the two there. But what's the
Yeah,
actual
like I think you're looking for a little black and white, and I think these are nuanced. And again, we all have our different set of things that lead us to do different things. I don't, and they could overlap in some areas and they contrast. I mean, people also have hierarchy in their values. They're actually their own values can conflict. And so
yeah,
sometimes it's important to know which one sits above the other one. I had someone that was like, don't hurt people and tell the truth. Well, I was like, what happens when the
they
truth means
conflict.
hurting? And she
Yeah,
really had to
yeah.
think about that. And to her, there was a clear answer, but it was important to think about that to know how you might react in one of those situations.
Right. So you could say in that situation, tell me that I'm wrong. If she actually believes that she's wrong, then she's completely fucking stuck because if it's gonna hurt you, then she can't say that because it's going to hurt you. But if she says anything else, then it's a lie. And so you can actually bind her in that situation and then see what happens, which is always interesting. I don't look at it as black and white. I look at it as what I'm doing with the coin is I'm sitting right in the middle and I'm allowing either way to happen. So it's really the antithesis of black and white. It's the allowance of what will happen and going with that. It's not always easy. It's
Right,
hard.
but you're putting not for right or wrong, and that you're putting it into an external capacity, and you feel like there's some external tilt on that, right? That will make a better
Well, this is
decision than you will.
Well,
Yeah,
this is interesting because this goes into the whole philosophy and the spirituality of it. Because I've got a belief that the external is the internal. There's a real oneness between
right.
the two.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
so
Yeah.
it's really trusting the collective unconscious to guide, which is, the infinite intelligence that Napoleon Hill talked about. We don't know what that means. So if you flip a coin, it's like the Beatles talked about. If you open a book and you read a sentence out of it, you can get inspiration from that. It was almost as though the sentence was meant to be read, which is it goes down a whole rabbit hole of possibilities. But it's interesting because you view things very differently, where you want to take absolute control over the situation. But what does that look like in the moment? Do you like, let's say on the ski lift, what's going through your head to make the decision if it's going to be jumping or
I
standing?
don't, yeah, I don't look, it's we all have a different viewpoint of like what is in control and what is not in control. Like
Yeah.
I'm very happy for a pilot to be piloting a plane and not me. I'm not looking to go grab the thing out of them. Like,
Right.
right, I'm looking for sort of competence and wisdom. So again, on that ski lift, I don't know. Again, if I've watched the video, to me, and I tend to cognitively process things at a certain speed, after the second or third one, it seems pretty clear that jumping looks like a better outcome than staying on, right? But that is just the way my brain processes the situation, and there could be a whole lot of layers to that or elsewhere.
So it's cognitive. So it's not a feeling that you're basing it off of. It is a very structured. If A happens, then B happens. Kind of a sequence of events that you're calculating in your head and making decisions based on logic rather than the emotion, the
Well,
feeling.
the more look, this is like Gladwell wrote, the book on this. And why can I not think of which one it was called? But that like when you make these decisions, it is not as flippant and quick as you think. Like I think maybe it was Tipping Point. Now I forget which one it was, but that it's thousands of hours of processing and thinking and comparative situations and otherwise. And so it seems like your brain's popping out sort of a random answer
Right.
of like
Yeah.
Kyle just doesn't seem trustworthy. But
Why do
my
you keep saying
brain's
that, man? Come on.
but
What the
my
hell's so wrong with
but
me? You
but
gotta keep using
well
this example.
before you were all about trust. So but Kyle doesn't seem trustworthy.
Why?
That's
What
my
about me doesn't
gut.
seem trustworthy? You keep using this example. Now I'm curious because now I'm noticing
I
a pattern. What is it about
no.
me that you makes it necessary to keep using this example of me not
Kyle
being
seems
trustworthy?
threatening. What is it
Threatening.
about that? Like it is that my brain probably is processing lots of past experiences and it's looking for similarities. And it's called Blink was the book, right?
Ah,
And
yeah.
sometimes we think we're afraid to trust that judgment. But what Gladwell sort of looked at was you could do the quick assessment in some of these things and you could go through the whole detailed one and they came pretty close to the same situation. So the hypothesis was that you're processing a lot of experiences, similar things otherwise in kind of real time based on your biases or otherwise, and you're making a decision in your head.
Right. See, that's the personal unconscious to me. I installed this sort of
Correct.
mechanism where if I make a decision, if the feeling goes to the right, then it's usually the right decision. If it goes to the left, like the right decision, whatever the hell that means.
Correct decision.
Right.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
yeah, that's, and you could argue that the wrong decision, quote unquote, also has right repercussions down the road. The wrongs have the rights. But the way that I make decisions, generally speaking, is where it's, if the feeling goes to the right, then the unconscious, the personal unconscious, is making that calculation based on all the previous experiences and saying, yes, this is based on everything that we've been through together, what the optimized route is, as opposed to the left. And so I don't do it consciously. I let the unconscious kind of the same exact thing that you're talking about have that swaying. And so that's my decision making process, which is very kinesthetic based because I trust the personal unconscious. You can't do it consciously. It's too much to calculate. It's so it's interesting, man. Where do you think?
Yeah. There's things that feel right for you, and those things that'll feel right for other people. And it's all circumstance. And there's a lot of childhood and trauma and
Yeah.
things that have happened or otherwise that
Yeah.
make us, believe deeply in these systems, or have come to trust them, for our intuition.
So what is it about me that's untrustworthy? I gotta ask. Why do we keep using this example?
I was just talking to someone about a trust why thing before, so it was just top of mind.
Okay, okay. Well, if you go back to the conversation, the personal unconscious is telling you something. So I wonder what
No,
comes to
it
mind.
was just a discussion I was having earlier today. So the in terms of a why, it's just the one I have the most anecdotes around.
Oh, okay, interesting. I got you, man. How do you know when to trust somebody? How do you know when it's a good idea as opposed to a bad idea? Let's unravel the unconscious process
For me personally,
for you personally.
yeah. So my trust is probably going to be based more on competence, right?
Confidence, right?
And me having seen the person make decisions or otherwise. Like it's an interesting orientation. Again, I think some people are just trying to size up the person, and then they're trying to decide. Once they decide the person, then everything's either good or bad, right? My
Mm.
process around that is the other way, is more anecdotal of this notion of like that trust is a little bit about, I think, competence and character. So I think I'm evaluating two things. One, the character of the individual, and then two, like the competence. They can have great character and make this wrong decisions over and over and over again. At some point, I'm not going to trust them in whatever that responsibility is, versus someone with a trust orientation. And I've talked to them again, they're looking to make the decision, and then everything else, everything is either falls under one thing or more after that. Mine's the opposite, which is I'm probably
Mm.
going to get a bunch of this data, and then I'm going to start to make nuanced decisions around, you know, if this person's on my team or otherwise, what I'm, trusting them to do, or where. Look, there's some people I've give very good advice and think in one area. One of the biggest problems of our time and influencers is that, like, you see someone with 1 million followers and they're a makeup specialist, and then you start, listening to their advice around politics or Middle East policy, and you realize they have no idea what they're talking about, and you're mistaking their competence in one area for competence
Ah.
in another.
So where do you think that correlates with the competence of watching somebody make a same mistake or make the same or actually the other side of that, which is succeed with a certain criteria? Where does that relate with making the blink decisions like Gladwell talks about, the trusting the unconscious, the personal unconscious to be able to make these decisions? Where do you see those two overlaying?
Look, there's, again, everything has a range.
Yeah.
Imagine someone on your team who makes really right decisions, but you don't trust why they're making them, or their values, their character, right? Well, that's a whole another set of issues, right?
I got you, man. So if I were to ask you a question, and it's interesting, it's a fascinating conversation we had. And if I were to ask you a question that you think would provide the most amount of value based on all of the personal unconscious you've collected over the years, what would that question be that would provide the most amount of value to an entrepreneur if I were to ask it?
Like, where do people's values come from? Probably
Oh, well,
yeah.
that is an infinitely deep question. Where do you think the people's values come from?
Uh, Look, I'm willing to have a lot of honest conversations with people, and if they're willing to go there, and this is in the work context, we talk about these things, and after hundreds, if not thousands, of these conversations, they are usually deep, formative childhood experiences, and they're carrying a lot of stuff around with them that they don't realize that they're carrying years later. And I don't think you should change that. I think a lot of the things that are formed are because of these experiences. I think you just need to honor it and understand it, and understand that it's real. Maybe if you're 20 and you really wanted to change some things, you could do it. By the time someone's 40, they're pretty well baked at that point. I'm not looking to change people that don't want to be changed, but I think, again, back to that person of a trust leader in the workplace, they need to understand that one of the things that happens with those leaders is they do what I was explaining to you before. They had some trust violation or something in their childhood, and so they very quickly put people into trustworthy or untrustworthy camp. and they tend to not move out of those buckets very easily. Like that can be that can be an asset as a leader, or it can be a liability as a leader. I think it's an asset if you know it and you articulate it and you explain it and you work with it. I think it's a liability if it's a total blind side for you.
Mm. What about nurture and nature? Do you find that because what I'm hearing from you is that it's all about nurture. What about the values that could be pre-baked into us, the recipe that was given before, like on the blank slate? Because there are differences in personality types, even with babies, for example. So where do you think that comes from? Which is where the infinitely complex or deep question comes into play. Where do you draw
Yeah.
the line between nature and nurture?
Do you have kids?
No, I do not. Not yet.
I think anyone who has kids will tell you, and where my sign is, I think it's 50% nurture, 50% nature. There are things about my same kids, same parents, they came out differently. One liked to be outward facing and external, and the other like to be inward facing. And they, one liked to hug as a baby and likes to hug. Like there's just a
Interesting.
bunch of things. So I think they're 50-50. I think the ones that people are overcompensating for tend to often be negative environmental situations, right? Rather than being like, look, I was always, it could, I mean, I've seen both. I don't hate to generalize. Again, I was, self-reliant because I had to be, or I just always, was this way. So again, I think they're ones where you're aligning to things that were always just part of your personality. And then there's ones, if you talk to me, they're constantly trying to avoid something or
Mhm.
overcome something or adjust for something that they can very clearly put a finger on and say, like, I don't want that ever to happen again.
Mm. So you say that it's based on yeah, that's an interesting point, man.
Parents can only get too much credit or too much blame. I've seen
Yeah,
like
true.
their two kids have nothing to do with each other, and they came from the same two parents. They were raised the same way, and they are just totally different. But again, I think environment. I mean, look, if you and I were grew up in a totally different part of the world in a different, we'd be different people, in some way.
So do you think you can go back and look at the nurture and adjust your leadership style based on where the origin of that value or that belief came from?
I think you could just lean into it. I don't think you should change anything. Again, I think it is and it's real
I like that.
for you, right?
Mhm.
So back to this example, and it's not a you, but I think the trust one, like if I realize that I, as a leader, make these decisions and judgments quickly on people because I had a huge violent, my dad upped and disappeared when I was 10 years old with not a warning or a clue, and I never saw him again, right? That's the type of story that tends to try to drive someone into a trust camp because they had a huge blind side. And so that's not going to happen again. And I'm going to be older and I'm going to be smart and I'm going to size people up, and that's not going to happen. Well,
Mhm.
again, if I know that and I communicate that to my team and I say, look, guys, I trust is important to me. Like I give it out, but you get it. But like, here are the things that you can do to break it. And honestly, like when you break it, it's really hard to get it back. It now I'm being honest with the team. And then what the team knows is if they do these things, they will get within the circle of trust. And but they also know my bright red lines. And they kind of know that if they cross that, like there's probably not a going back.
Hmm. So you were raised to believe that you had to be completely self-reliant because you lost your father essentially when you were 10.
No, that was a hypothetical story.
Oh.
No, I was giving you
Oh, well,
just
what
an
the fuck?
example of
I was like, damn, man, this guy had a this guy had a hard
no, I
childhood,
was giving you an
man.
example of where trust is not one of my whys at all. Like I said, for me, trust
Oh,
is more of a
okay.
competence thing than it is a like I trust people or their ideas more than I try to suss them up. Again,
I
it's
see, I
not.
see.
Yeah, yeah. Sorry, no, that was just a hype. That was an archetype fusing together a lot of real
Right.
stories I've heard in the
Hmm.
past.
I trusted you, man. Damn.
Sorry.
That's funny, brother. All right, man. What else do you have to add before we kick this off? Interesting conversation, seriously.
Oh, that was a lot.
It was a lot. Yeah. Was it too much? What do you think about it?
No, all good. This stuff's fascinating. Again, I think this stuff is very, as you're building companies and teams, I think everyone has some aspect of this stuff, going on. And the challenge is to understand that and understand where the different styles and archetypes and stuff either work together or don't work together, or the what's the job, right? What's being asked to do, and how does that align with the things that person does naturally well or otherwise, right? Look, there's a lot of personality types that are great for a head of sales that aren't great for a CFO. They're great for a CEO, but they're not great for a customer service person. So there's a wide range of things, and I think if we spend some more time in the workplace really getting into these, like what makes up someone's kind of unique leadership style, that I think that they could be a better leader.
Well, let's leave it with this then. If somebody were to identify their values and they have an inventory of them, what makes them feel good, what doesn't, what guides their decisions and how they look back and how they experience if it was a good or bad decision. Let's say they've done that work, they've got their values. How do they go about finding which role to take based on that input that they were the values that they've cemented or at least observed?
I think it becomes self-evident, right? So I just worked with someone who,
Hmm.
and there's nuance again, in is it the role or how is the role being operated? He was someone who needed a lot of autonomy and he needed a lot of trust. And he was asked to do an investigation for a board, and then they were all micromanaged every aspect of it. He's like, I hate this, and he quit the whole thing. And when he looked at his values, it was very clear that like I'm super responsible, but you need to give me, I don't remember what they were, but you need to give me space and I need to have room to, I think like one of his things was like room to operate. And they were like suffocating him on this thing. So like had
Hmm.
he articulated that earlier, he could have been like, look, I will do this investigation, but I will do this investigation if you give me 60 days to go off and do it. If he knew that he was going to be asked to report in every day, he never would have agreed to do it in the first place. And I think that became really clear to him after he figured that out.
So it's interesting. Once you have the values, you can set expectations and essentially set guidelines or even rules in the game that you're playing with others to create these boundaries, and it allows everybody to have a more seamless and smooth experience.
Yeah, look, and there's some situations you can do that more than others. And some
Yeah.
people say, look, if you work for someone else, sometimes you got to live on the edges of your values and you're not happy then. There's some things that you got to do, but that's not a good place to stay long term,
Mm,
right? If you need to
right.
do it for a month or some days or otherwise, there's some CEOs that, are all about contributing and people and whatever. And if they have to do a layoff, like it's going to crush them. But that's what they have, the company needs that day. But you don't want to make that person George Clooney and up in the air and flying around and being the one who
Right.
lays it. Like some people might like that. That person is going to be absolutely miserable.
Like the female that was the one that was automating things online as opposed to having flying around, right? That was her value, and she didn't like the actual being in person telling people that you're fired. So
Yeah, she probably has some process
yeah.
intuition or otherwise, and again, so there are types of people you want to associate, relationships, their environments, their projects. To that thing of the investigation, it's also about the how, saying, look, I'm happy to do this, but like, let's just be really clear, like how this is going to go down before
Mhm.
I do it.
There's something to say about that. Setting the rules of the game that you're playing with others ahead of time, making it clear that everybody's okay with it. It's copacetic to all, and then you can go about playing the game in the way that's optimized to you. And you can't do that unless you have the values. You know what rules to
Yeah,
play.
you can't do that unless you have your instruction manual. The values to me are
Structure
the
manual.
instruction
Mm.
manual that no one gave you when you were born, being like, this is Kyle 101. Like, do this, don't do this.
Mm. Do you have an instruction manual that you've like an actual like you've looked at the rules that you'll accept and
To me,
won't?
that is the
That is
values at the
that's
end
the
of the day.
values,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah.
Okay, so it's a full circle, man. Robert, dude, we had a fascinating conversation, man. Anything else you want to add before we kick this off?
No, are we kicking it off or are we ending it?
Well, they're one and the same. That's one of
Kicking it
my
off
values
usually
is
means
using.
starting in my mind, but I thought we were started. So no, I'm good. Look, if anyone's interested in any of what I'm talking about, robertglazer.com, glazr.com, for my newsletter, podcast, books, all that stuff is, and the course is located.
Right on. All right. How do you get the course? Was it a free course or what's the price on that?
It's I think it's $99.
Oh, really?
And if that's not worth you figuring out your values, then to me, things like that, like when they're free, people won't actually do the work.
It's true.
And I
Yeah.
want people to take it and do the work, and over 2,000 people have done it and had pretty big impact.
So if $100 isn't worth getting the game manual
Yeah,
rules, then you're not the right person
then
for it.
you should not do that. There's some self-selection.
I love it, man. Robert, dude,
All
thank
right.
you so much for being here, man. We'll talk soon, all right?
Thanks. Take care.
Thank you, brother. Bye.